Welcome to Sarder TV. I'm Vaishali Jain. We're excited to have Ann-May Chang join us today. Ms. Chang is the author of the book Lean Impact: How to Innovate for Radically Social Good. She's also been a technology executive for large companies like Google and Apple, and she's here to tell us more. Ann-May, thank you so much for joining us today. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let's start off by talking about some of your prior experience. You were Chief Innovation Officer at USAID and Mercy Corps. You worked as a senior advisor for the State Department, and you also have been a technology executive for companies like Google and Apple and Intuit. Tell us more.
Sure. Well, I've really had two fairly distinct careers. I started out studying as a software engineer in college and then went to work at a number of different tech companies in Silicon Valley, from small startup companies to big companies like Google, Apple, and Intuit. But through that time, for probably 20 years, I had this notion that I wanted to spend the first half of my career in the tech world and the second half of my career doing something more meaningful, doing something to make the world a better place. And so about 7 years ago, I made that shift. I made the leap and left Google, and a world that I had kind of really loved and thrived in, and dove into something completely different, and decided to focus on global poverty. And to do that, I went through a fellowship called the Franklin Fellowship to the State Department that I called my Custom Masters in Public Policy, where I got to learn from some of the brightest and best people in the space and got a much better feel for the world. And that led me eventually to Mercy Corps to get a better feel for the work on the ground of how global development actually works in context. And then I got what I think was my dream job at USAID as the Chief Innovation Officer and leading something called the Global Development Lab that was looking at how we could use innovation to transform and dramatically accelerate our progress in ending global poverty.
How much time did you spend in the private sector?
So I worked in Silicon Valley for about 23 years, like I said, in big companies and small companies.
What was the time where you felt like, okay, I need to start doing something different and focusing more on the social sector? What was it that kind of inspired you to make that shift?
Well, the inspiration actually came something like 25 years ago. There was a woman that I knew as an acquaintance who worked at Apple. Her name was Elizabeth Birch, and she was an executive at Apple. And she one day announced that she was leaving her job and going to DC to run an organization called the Human Rights Campaign. And I was really stunned by this. She'd been a very successful executive, and I became inspired by this idea that, hey, I could, and I was very early in my career then, I was in my early 20s, and I got this idea that I wanted to do the same thing, that I wanted to have a great career in Silicon Valley, learn a bunch, contribute a bunch, but then really take my skills and expertise and look at where I could make a big difference in the world.
You received a lot of inspiration from the book, The Lean Startup. Tell us how you've applied some of the principles in Lean Startup in your book in new and valuable ways.
For those people who aren't familiar with the Lean Startup, it's a book by Eric Ries that came out something like 7 years ago. And what I feel the Lean Startup did was really capture the best practices of innovation that are behind this rapid pace of progress that we see out of Silicon Valley. We all see the cool apps and websites and things like that, but what drives that? And his insight was that what helps us drive innovation and what's behind innovation is not, the big idea. We like to focus on, coming up with a big game-changing idea that will change everything. But really what it's more about is the process of testing, measuring, and iterating. And he calls this build, measure, learn, and the build, measure, learn cycle. And this isn't rocket science. The build, measure, learn is essentially based on the scientific method. The idea is that you have a potential solution. If you're working in a realm of high uncertainty, there's a lot of things that could go wrong. So rather than investing huge amounts of money in designing, testing, manufacturing, building out infrastructure, before doing all that, how about if we run small experiments to learn? And so using the scientific method, we frame a hypothesis, we build an experiment to test that hypothesis, we measure the results, gather data, and then we learn something. And if it's successful, then maybe we know it's safe to double down. And if it's not successful, then we know maybe we need to adjust our solution or even take a more significant pivot.
And a lot of your book does that, right? It takes this uncompromising attitude towards maximizing social good, and at its core are the tenets of scientific method. Can you tell us more about how that's applied in your book?
Yeah, so the lean startup really came out of the tech startup world. And so a lot of the examples and a lot of the techniques are really honed for that space. And so what I found is a lot of people who are in the social good space, whether they're nonprofits or triple bottom line companies or social entrepreneurs, have read the lean startup and struggled a little bit to figure out how to make it work in their context. Because there's a lot more complexity in the social good space, which we can talk about. And so what I tried to do is really take these techniques and bring them into the realm of social good. So I interviewed over 200 different organizations in the research for the book to understand how they made this happen, sort of the pioneers. And it's people took really creative approaches. It's a lot harder to measure impact, for example, than it is to measure an e-commerce hit. And so some of these things are just harder to do in the social sector, but I believe they're just as important, if not more important, because we have a responsibility to make the world a better place. And it's tools like the Lean Startup, like Build, Measure, Learn, that can really accelerate our progress.
Tell us who should read your book.
I wrote Lean Impact really for anyone who's trying to achieve greater social good in the world. Whether it's with their time, their work, their money, what they buy. The idea is we need to think about social good in as rigorous a way as we think about profits. Companies are set up to maximize shareholder profit. We're set up to orient against in our own investment portfolios and our own retirement funds to maximize our earnings. But when it comes to social good, I don't think we've been nearly rigorous enough. We're happy if we give our donation to an organization who's generally doing good. We don't ask if they're maximizing social good, if they're getting most bang for the buck of any organization out there. And for nonprofits, again, we feel good if we're doing good, we're helping people, and we see the results of that help. But I think there's a lot more we could do to maximize that, both by optimizing what we're doing today, but then also taking the risks to find ways that we can apply game-changing new solutions that could dramatically change the game.
Tell us how the strategies in your book can be applied to organizations that are not in the social sector. Mm-hmm. Are they applicable?
Absolutely. I think that, these days, social good has become part of the fabric. I think every company is thinking about how they can do more good in the world. Some because the leadership passionately believes in it, but some, honestly, because their stakeholders are pressuring them to. People want to buy from companies who have a social mission. They want to work at companies that are doing social good and feel part of that. They want to invest in companies through impact investing or investment screens for companies that are doing good. And so I think companies, either innately or from their pressures outside, are more and more seeing their contribution to the world, not just as their product or service that they sell, but how are they making the world a better place? And so the same techniques in Lean Impact, I think, are really applicable for those companies to look at how they can, just as much as they're driving for greater profits, drive for a greater impact.
Start off by telling us what some of the barriers are to social innovation.
Yeah, after working in Silicon Valley for so many years and coming into the social sector, I was surprised at how much harder it is. At first I was just like, why don't people just do this? It's obvious. And I found that there's a lot of systemic barriers. It's not just that people want to innovate, but I think there's a lot of constraints that make it harder. The biggest one, I would say, is around funding. That the way that social sector organizations are funded is often very inflexible, and it keeps them from doing the things that maybe make the most sense always. In the private sector, you usually you have a really simple feedback loop because your customer is usually the one that buys and pays for your service. So if you have a product or service that your customer doesn't want, they won't buy it, and you figure out very quickly that you're off the mark. When it comes to social good, we often have people we call beneficiaries who we're trying to help, but they're often not the ones who are buying the product or service. It's the funders who are paying for it. And these two customers, their interests are not always aligned. And so you can have funders sort of pushing you in one direction, and you may be providing something for beneficiaries, which may or may not be the thing that's most valuable to them. And so I think that's sort of at the root of some of the challenges, but also the structure of funding can get in the way. A lot of times grants are fairly inflexible. They sort of enforce what I think of as a waterfall model that comes from the software development world, where you plan everything well in advance and then you execute on that plan for a long period of time, and you don't deviate from that plan. And a lot of grants force us to do that, and it makes it difficult for us to do the sort of iteration and pivoting and learning that's necessary to drive innovation. In addition to funding, there's a number of other factors that make innovating in the social sector harder. Like you said earlier, measuring social impact often takes years to fully realize. It's a lot harder than measuring e-commerce hits. We have to be a lot more responsible when we're experimenting with people who are often in vulnerable situations. And so all of these things combine to make innovation for social good a lot harder.
So given some of the challenges that you've mentioned around funding, what are some of the options that social impact entrepreneurs have for funding? What are some of your recommendations?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because funding is really at the crux of social innovation. A lot of times I think we seek the wrong kind of funding for where we are in this cycle. So if you have a solution that is tested, where you know that you're delivering value, you know that it has social impact, you know that it has a path to scale, then you can start seeking larger amounts of funding that help you execute on that plan. But in many cases, we have solutions that there's still a lot of questions out there. It's still, a lot of things that we need to improve about it to be able to meet the needs that exist in the world. And in those cases, I think we need to look at funding that is more flexible, that will support innovation. So there's three things that I would recommend for social entrepreneurs. So one is, if you're still innovating, look for smaller amounts of funding. We always sort of measure ourselves by how much funding we secured, but it's actually the smaller, more flexible funding that you need in the early stages when you're trying to innovate, not a huge amount of money, because you want to experiment, run smaller experiments that help you learn much more quickly. The second thing is, and this is something that is a little bit scary, is to push back on funders. I think a lot of people who are trying to raise money are a little bit cowed by funders because they hold all the power. They hold the purse strings. I've talked to many social entrepreneurs who've been willing to push back on their funders and earned respect as a result. Because if your funder sort of pushes you into a corner that isn't really for the best of your social enterprise or for the best of the kind of solution you're trying to develop, it doesn't do anyone any good. And you know best kind of what's necessary to succeed. And I think it's worthwhile letting the funders know that and telling them what you need in order to do that. The third is to really insist on flexibility. Some of the best social enterprises I know of have really pushed back on the funders and said, hey, we're only going to take your funding if it's unrestricted, so that we have the flexibility to pursue things each step of the way based on what we've learned and what works best, and not get sort of shoved into a narrow corner where things may be suboptimal.
How do you go about creating metrics that actually measure social impact, especially when it's intangible or hard to measure?
I think most organizations who are in the social good space are familiar with something we call the theory of change. And that basically describes how an organization's activities ultimately result in the impact that we want. We do something, we touch a certain number of people, we have a certain outcome, it eventually leads to a long-term impact of, breaking the cycle of poverty or including the, resilience of a society. Those things at the end can be fairly intangible, or at least take a very long time to realize. Did we empower women? Did we, make a country more resilient to natural disasters? Like, those things can take a long time, or it can be intangible to measure. And so, what I recommend in the book is that as you develop that theory of change, you have an idea of, we're doing this activity and it will hopefully lead to this over time. What are the linkages along the way? What has to happen? If you're trying to empower women, maybe you do a training. Maybe as a result of the training, you hope that they'll do something different. And so what we want to do is test the earlier precursors those earlier linkages that will eventually lead to the impact we want. We still want to measure the impact in the fullness of time, but we can't wait for years until that happens, or otherwise we're just not going to learn. If it didn't work, we're years down the road and a lot of money down the road. And so finding those earlier precursors and testing and measuring them. So for example, if you're trying to empower women, maybe you're offering some sort of training or some sort of mentoring or coaching that you hope will empower the women. Well, what are some of the indicators that you might measure to see, like, are they behaving differently? Maybe more women have their own mobile phones that didn't before. Maybe they're speaking up at the village meetings. What are those sort of early indicators that will show you that something different's happening as a result? And if it's not, to go back and maybe look at how you can improve whatever your intervention was.
So it's really about measuring those small wins and milestones along the way and make sure that you're along the right path.
Exactly, and it's not only measuring it, but it's optimizing for them, right? So we often settle for doing any good, something change for some people. And one of the things I think is important for us to do is really look at those unit metrics. Like what percent, if we do a training, what percentage of women or what percentage of youth are doing something different as a result? And if we can optimize our training, maybe we add a new module, maybe we use a different pedagogical technique, and we can improve that. If we go from 40% are doing something different to 80% doing something different, that dramatically magnifies our impact as we scale.
So your methods also follow a non-linear process, which you say is important to bringing a more broader perspective to social innovation. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I think a lot of times when people think of innovation, they think of the big idea. We're going to come up with a big idea. It's going to be brilliant, and it's going to change everything. The reality of innovation is it's not linear. It's not one idea, then, everything changes. It's a very circuitous path from that initial germ of an idea to making a difference in the world. And, when I go back in my career and I look at some of the most innovative companies on the planet, Google, Facebook. Google didn't invent search. They continued to test and iterate and improve the algorithms, the user interface, the feature set to become head and shoulders above their competitors. Same with Facebook. Facebook didn't invent social networking. And we should keep that in mind when we're looking at trying to deliver social impact, that you may have a brilliant idea initially, but that's the 1%. There's a quote from Edison I love, that genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. And innovation is much more about that 99%, about the blood, sweat, and tears that goes into testing, measuring, and learning and iterating to continue to improve your solution by small steps as well as big leaps.
So how should we focus on setting goals when trying to maximize social impact?
Yeah, I think that when it comes to social good, we often tend to be plan based on constraints rather than needs. And what I mean by that is, a nonprofit will tend to look at, here's how much money I have, how much staff I have, or maybe the envelope of a grant of how long and how much money a grant might provide, and say, what can I do with this? What's the most good I can do with what I have today? What I think is important is for us to step back from what exists today and look at what are the needs in the world? What is the problem we're really trying to solve here? And what will it take to move the needle? And it's a different way of thinking. It forces us to, again, stretch to think beyond what we know how to do and maybe take some risks to get there. And so I believe that an audacious goal is really the birthplace of innovation. If your goals are something that you can reach with business as usual, there's no reason to take those risks and potentially fail and to think out of the box. But when you have an audacious goal that you're going after and you're galvanizing your team around, that is something that will really make a difference in the world, but you don't know how to do it yet, that's where innovation comes from. And you think about things like, President Kennedy's call to send a man to the moon. These kinds of audacious goals inspire people and get them to really stretch. And I think that's where innovation comes from.
In your book, you also talk about the importance of problem discovery. And you give a great example of a woman named Kinnari Webb and her love of orangutans and the process that she followed. Can you tell us more?
Absolutely. So Kinnery actually is a friend of mine, and she loves orangutans. I mean, who doesn't? Many orangutans live in Borneo, in Indonesian Borneo, and she wanted to save their habitat so that they could thrive because they were under threat. And so, traditionally what people might do is, we want to save habitat, let's run a conservation project. That's what's needed. But she decided to do something different. She went to Indonesian Borneo and lived in those communities to learn from people there what was going on. And there's a technique that came from lean manufacturing, also used in lean startup, called the 5 whys. And she just asked these questions. Why is the rainforest being cut down? It turned out that it was because people were trying to raise money. Why were people trying to raise money? Because they had a loved one that was sick. Why did they need to raise that much money? Because there was no local health facility. They'd have to send someone to a far-off hospital that was both expensive, and the transport to get there was expensive. Why were there no local health facilities? Because these were poor people living in these rural areas, and the government didn't prioritize providing health care. And so by asking these kind of questions and sort of unraveling bit by bit what was behind this drive for deforestation, she got to the root cause, which was that people needed health care. And so instead of a traditional conservation project, she started something called Health in Harmony that built a health clinic in the community to help provide for people's needs, and saw the deforestation plummet dramatically.
What are the 3 hypotheses that entrepreneurs need to consider when it comes to social innovation?
I think there's 3 pillars that are crucial for any social innovation to truly thrive. And what I mean by thrive is having both the breadth and the depth of impact that will really move the needle in the world. And they are value, impact, and growth. So value is this something that people actually want? Not just that they'll be happy to accept, but will they demand it? Will they come back for more? Will they tell their friends? Is it something that they really feel a deep-held need for? If it's not something that people really want, you have an uphill battle. The second is impact. So if people want it and you get it to them, does it work? Does it actually move the needle on the problem you're trying to solve? Does it have the social impact you're trying to solve? And then third, if people want something, you can get it to them and it makes a difference. Can you actually scale it? Is there an engine for growth that will get it to anywhere close to the size of the need in the world? Too often what I see, and this is true for even many design techniques, is that they focus on 1 or 2, but rarely all 3 of these. And what you end up finding is solutions that are highly impactful, but only reach a tiny number of people, or solutions that reach millions of people, but really have very little impact. And so I think it's important for us to have all 3 of these dimensions in a balanced way if we really want to make a big difference.
Do you find that social entrepreneurs lack that balance often, or generally in the work that you've done, does it incorporate all 3?
What I found is that in many cases, social entrepreneurs and, like I said, even design techniques tend to focus on 1 or 2 of these, but rarely all 3. And I think it's one of the reasons that we see a lot of exciting innovations in the world, but not very many of them getting to massive impact and scale, is because we're falling down on 1 or the other of these. And it's understandable because, again, as we talked about with the funding environment, entrepreneurs are really pushed to deliver and often pushed to scale too soon before they've really validated these basic tenets of their solution.
So why is it important to start small and iterate fast?
Well, what I'd say is one of the most critical elements of innovation is to start small. We often are pressured because of real needs in the world, or because of funding, or just because of our own impatience to try to roll things out before we've really fully understood what we're doing. And so by starting small, if you're testing something with just 5 people or 10 people, you can spend a lot less money and you can have a lot more control, and you can learn far more quickly than when you're trying to roll something out to thousands of people. And so the idea of starting small and running these experiments, we call them MVPs, or minimum viable products. They allow us to learn much more quickly where something may be off the mark before we make a much bigger investment. And the whole idea of this is not because experiments are fun or anything, but because it can save us a lot of time and money. The idea of lean is, from lean manufacturing, is to eliminate waste. And what we want to do is eliminate the waste of investing and rolling something out that may not work, so that we actually get the basics right before we double down on it.
Tell us about the 1 Acre Fund as an example.
So 1 Acre Fund is a really inspiring social enterprise in Africa. And what they're doing is working with smallholder farmers who are some of the most poor and disadvantaged people on the planet. They live on small plots of land and try to eke out a living on these small farms. And 1 Acre Fund is trying to do is help them improve their livelihoods by improving their farm yields. And they do this by providing them seed and fertilizer, training them on farming techniques, connecting them to markets, and so forth. And they've been incredibly successful. They've helped more than 600,000 farmers on average increase their incomes by 50%. And how do they get there? It's interesting. It was an early failure that helped them develop their process of innovation. And so in the early days, at one point, they saw an opportunity to add a new potential crop to their offerings, and that was passion fruit. It looked like there was a good market for it. It looked like farmers could sell it for a good amount of money, so there was a buyer, and so they rolled it out to their entire farmer network. And it didn't go as they expected. It turned out that it was really hard to cultivate passion fruit well, and so the farm yields were much lower than they projected. And it was expensive to transport to the markets, and they weren't able to fetch as high a price as they thought. And so overall, it was a failure. And they spent a lot of time and money, as well as put farmers' lives on the line in doing this. And so it was a wake-up call for them. And what they recognized was, we can't do it this way. We need to start smaller. And so they put together their process for innovation, which involves, very much in line with Lean Impact. They start out with small experiments with just a few farmers to see, whether something will work the way they expect, and then, kind of refine it and improve that, and then gradually tier up and stage their rollout. So by the time they go out to the whole network, they have pretty high confidence that they've worked out the kinks and know that something's going to work.
Tell us how technology is a game changer for data collection, and what are some low-cost data collection technologies that can be used for social enterprise?
So, a lot of times people are very excited about the potential for technology and social good. We endlessly hear about artificial intelligence and big data and blockchain and drones. Well, I actually think that we know what the killer app is for social good. And I think that is technology for data collection. Because traditionally, especially when you're working in remote rural areas, data collection has been very slow and not very accurate. And it makes it very hard for us to get the information we need to drive the innovation process. And now that mobile phones have proliferated around the world, we have the potential to collect data much more quickly, much more accurately, and much more cheaply. And that's through technology. And this can be as simple as like an SMS survey, where you send an SMS out and poll people for their feedback on how something went or what their opinion on something is. Or it can be mobile-enabled surveys where people are going out and interviewing people and collecting the data on a mobile phone and being able to send that right up to the office, over the wireless airwaves. And it can even be more advanced technology like sensors, which are able to detect, how much a water pump is being used, or whether the well is still working. These are things that would have taken a long time to determine using more traditional techniques.
You've also spoken a little bit about behavioral science in your book, and about the concept of behavioral design. Mm-hmm. Tell us more about these and how they're applied.
So behavioral science is really an interdisciplinary approach to understanding how people behave and what they do. It's human beings are quirky. We don't always do what's right for us, what's good for us, what's expected of us. And a classic example of behavior design is the use of kind of opt-ins versus opt-outs. So, if you want to encourage people to do something that's good for them, such as, open up a retirement account or be an organ donor, the studies have found that if you make it, make the default for people to be opted in, and they have to make a deliberate choice to opt out, they still have an option, dramatically more people will sign up. And so a lot of times we think of, when we want to innovate, people feel like, oh, I'm just not that creative. How do I think outside of the box and come up with these big ideas? And behavioral science, I think, is a good complement to human-centered design that can point the way to what's worked before. We have a lot of scientific studies that tell us how people behave. And if you're, in many cases in the social sector, we're trying to encourage people to change their behavior. And it's the lessons from behavioral science that can feed into our designs and help us build something that will work with human tendency rather than against it.
How has this been applied? How have you seen this type of science applied in some of the work that you've done?
There's an interesting example in Australia. The Behavioral Insights team in Australia worked with the Australian government that was thinking about increasing the taxes on drinks with high sugar content. But they were getting pushback from the drinks manufacturers that that might damage our sales, and so they weren't sure, and they also weren't sure whether this would discourage people from buying the sugary drinks. So they tried an experiment in a hospital, Alfred Hospital, and what they did was they increased the price of sugary drinks by 20% in the vending machines of the hospital to see what would happen. And it turned out that people did buy fewer sugary drinks, and that decrease in sales was made up by people buying more healthy drinks. And so they were able to go to the drinks manufacturers and say, hey, you're not going to lose revenue this way because people are just buying different drinks. It's not that they're not buying drinks at all. And it helped pave the road forward to making this policy change.
Now, in part 3 of your book, which is about transformation, you talk about how to really tackle the world's toughest problems, you have to go beyond the interventions and really change systems and ecosystems. Tell us more about this, and how do you go about doing something like that?
In the world of social good, many of the challenges that we try to tackle exist because both markets and policy have failed. The business world is not serving people well, and the government isn't picking up the slack. And so when we just go ahead and kind of try to fill that gap, it can just be putting Band-Aids on the problem because the system is fundamentally broken. And so I think it's important to go beyond just thinking about those Band-Aids and thinking about how do we change the system. To use the example of homelessness, if you provide temporary housing for homeless people, you're certainly doing a good deed. You're certainly helping people that day. But unless you change the policy so that there is affordable housing available for people to rent or buy, and that there's a safety net from the government standpoint for people who are between jobs or fall on hard times, it's going to be a perpetual issue that we're going to have to keep patching, right? And so it's looking beyond that sort of the symptom of the problem to how do we change the system so that the problem hopefully is overall reduced over time.
I know some of the research that you point out in your book has shown that people will buy from companies that are associated with some sort of social good, which is really fascinating. Can you tell us more about what the research says?
I think we all see that people are thinking about social good in all aspects of their lives these days. And research from Cone Communications has shown that 89% of Americans are more likely to buy from a company that has a social mission. And 60% of people are more likely to invest in, make an investment in a company that has, social environmental benefit. And 75% of millennials and 55% of people overall are willing to take a lower salary to work at a company with a social mission that they believe in. And so people are voting with their feet and their dollars. And I think it is creating an environment where all companies are being more thoughtful about their overall impact in the world.
Tell us about how your experience in the private sector as a technology executive has helped you in your social impact work.
So I was lucky to spend 23 years of my career in Silicon Valley, where I think, I think many people think of Silicon Valley as the hotbed of innovation. And, certainly, working at companies like Google, got to see, what's under the, what's behind the scenes of how innovation really happens. And it's not always sexy, but it's fascinating. And it really is this, focus on data of, like understanding the data, having big aspirations for what we're trying to do, and constantly, working day in and day out to experiment and improve on what we're doing. So that we, there's an expectation in Silicon Valley, if you've heard of Moore's Law. Moore's Law from 50 years ago projected that every 2 years, the number of transistors on a computer chip would double. And so it means that a computer that used to take up the computing power that used to require a computer the size of a building to have, now fits in your pocket. And the amazing things that we're able to do as a result is truly mind-blowing. And so there's this expectation of progress and this expectation of the pace of change that is in my blood now from working in Silicon Valley for so long. And I carry that to the social good space. And I think that, we need a little bit more of that there. We need more of that, both the ambition and the impatience of, driving faster progress.
Tell us a little bit more about the work you did at USAID and at Mercy Corps as well, from a social impact perspective.
Well, USAID, at the lab at USAID, which is where I worked, we were really looking at ways as a funder. So USAID is a U.S. government's foreign aid agency, and we fund efforts to alleviate global poverty and for humanitarian assistance around the world. And at the lab, what we were doing is really looking at more innovative ways to fund so that we could encourage innovation. And one of the types of mechanisms we used was something called Development Innovation Ventures, or DIV. And DIV was modeled very differently than a traditional USAID grant. So traditionally, a USAID grant might be for many millions of dollars. You plan everything up front and you spend 3 to 5 years implementing that plan, and then at the end of that, you wrap up and go home. We didn't think that that was a great way to drive innovation. And so instead, we modeled ourselves after venture capital, where you place a number of smaller bets. So in the first tier of DIV funding is just $100,000. And so when you start smaller like that, you can place a lot more bets and take a lot more risk and cast a wider net for innovative solutions that may be out there. Take some chances. And sometimes they pay off and sometimes they don't. But when they don't, we failed small. It's okay, even though there's a lot of scrutiny on spending taxpayer money. When you're using small increments like that, I think people understand that, you're experimenting and you're learning as a result. And at the same time, we're finding some things that, are really transformative. And so when we do see things that get traction and work, then we double down. Then we give them, larger grants, like $1 million, and then later $5 million. And it's this sort of tiered evidence-based funding model that venture capital is built upon, different rounds of VC funding that startups get, that I think is one tool for funders to be able to encourage innovation.
Yeah. Any other final thoughts on lean impact?
So as a final thought, I guess what I would say is for people who are watching this, if you're thinking, gosh, I'm not sure where to get started, I think a lot of times we let perfect be the enemy of the good. And part of the sort of essence of lean impact is to just learn by doing. So I really encourage people, like, even if you don't know exactly how you're going to do this, get out of the building, start talking to your customers, start trying to run some imperfect experiments. And even though you may get a few things wrong, you'll learn very quickly what you got wrong and what you got right, and that will help you refine things. So, don't be daunted. Don't wait till you feel like you have all the answers and know exactly what you're doing. Just get started.
Ann May, this was a great conversation that we had. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. This is a lot of fun.
And we'll see you next time on Sartor TV.